All right, welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette, and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, all the way from Pune in India, is Sumit Gayatri Moge. And Sumit, you are an Agile coach and a product manager at ThoughtWorks, a head of remote for hire, which super interesting. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But most importantly for me, you have written the Async First playbook. And I think this is very interesting because you are really being an Agile coach and being a product manager, you are in the thick of Agile. So we're going to get into all of that, but let's start with the first question. You can see I'm already super excited to talk to you. The first question though, what is your virtual office and what do you need to get your work done?
Well, the thing that I need to get my work done is lots of coffee. And I think you've heard this a lot on your show, right? So good coffee. In fact, I do too much of it. I probably do 4 or 5 of them each day. So that's my fuel. But my workspace is quite straightforward. I've got a big monitor in front of me, a couple of screens here. And the most important thing for me is a dedicated keyboard and a dedicated trackpad because, well, I write a lot and a lot of my communication with my colleagues is written. And so that just makes things comfortable for me. And frankly, I don't work outside this room that you're seeing. I've got a room in my house set up for work. And then when I'm out of this room, I finish my virtual commute and I get back to life. So that's generally my mode of working because I don't travel much. So I'm not set up to be a digital nomad. I have this one workspace, which happens to be an office. And so I make the virtual commute in, and then I make the virtual commute out. And I also dress up for work.
Do you have any other rituals for like a wind down or a startup ritual?
Yeah, so generally at the start of a day, I'll take stock of things that I need to achieve that particular day. And generally, I try to keep my first half meeting free. So until 1 p.m., I have no meetings whatsoever. So what I usually try to do is say, all right, what are my most important things that I just need to get out of the door in this first half of the morning? And then if I don't do anything else for the rest of the day and I'm stuck in meetings for the second half, I don't feel so bad because I've got a whole bunch of things accomplished in the beginning of the day. And then usually before I wind down, I take stock of what did I do? Is there something that I need to take back tomorrow? Is Trello, our task board, updated? Have I moved things around so that I'm creating transparency? And that just helps create closure for the day. And then I turn off everything and then I vacate this room.
And no checking emails at like, right before bed or any of that, or do you keep it real separate?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I'd gotten into this really bad habit during the pandemic because, uh, when the pandemic was raging on, there was this feeling of disconnection, right? And somehow going to Slack, going to email was like trying to wrest back that sense of connection. And I saw that that was creeping into my personal life. So somewhere at the start of, actually not at the start, maybe the middle of 2021, I started using the service called Freedom, which basically blocks out email from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. in the morning for me. I mean, email, social media, Slack, everything's blocked out for those hours. So then much as I try, I can't go back to any of those. I have to focus on life, family, all of those things.
Wow, brilliant. I never heard of it. And indeed, why not? If because with willpower, it just takes one weak moment. That's the thing with willpower. It's like you could be good and good and good, and then at the very last minute, boff, you eat the cookie or you do whatever it is, check the email, whatever it is. So I like
There's the
that you
thing that
use
they
an app
talk
for that.
about, right? There's the thing that they talk about, which is the what the hell effect, which is the moment your willpower sags and you enter that moment of weakness and you break your rules once, then it's like, oh, what the hell? Why don't I break it again? Like, why don't I do it properly this time?
Right, 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 right. This time I'm eating the whole bag of cookies, right?
Yeah,
Indeed,
exactly.
indeed. And that is the thing. But as people who work from home or from wherever they are as remote workers working asynchronously, we'll get into that. Discipline and sort of the boundaries between work and life become really important. So that's why I ask about specific rituals, because given that you can close the door and then life is different on the other side of the door, you still need to wind down. That was sort of the beauty of the commute, or I would say the silver lining of the terrible thing we all called the commute.
Yeah.
So the Async First Playbook, why did you write this?
Yeah, look, my role's that of a consultant, right? So I build software for a living with teams for clients. And you've got to try and live my life mentally for a bit and think about the way teams in India work. So we're often serving clients in Europe, in North America, huge time zone differences. And try and think about winters in the Northern Hemisphere and a client in San Francisco and a team in India. There is no time zone overlap.
Right. It's
So
what, 13 and a half hours or something?
13.5 hours. So
Right.
basically somebody's staying up. Somebody is staying up at the cost of their personal lives if they are trying to do this the overlap way.
Right.
Right. So there's that part of it, which I saw, with travel going down, a whole bunch of things that we used to do pre-pandemic going down. Because for now, if you actually look at visas, they're really difficult to get. So you have to wait for 280 days to get a US visa from India. That's how difficult it is. So even those things that
Wow.
used to make it easier, they're not as easy anymore post-pandemic. So I saw a lot of pain with people trying to overlap and live in two time zones at the same time.
Mhm.
But then, what happens with this kind of way of working, which is very meeting centric, is beyond a certain point, many things become difficult. It becomes difficult to onboard people, offboard people, becomes difficult to solve complex problems because everyone's got everything in their heads and there's only so much cognitive capacity you have in your heads, right? And then, look, I grew up speaking English almost as a first language. So I'm very comfortable in these kind of settings. But in a multicultural setup, it's really the boldest, the most extroverted people who end up speaking up. So if you have a very meeting-centric culture, then those kinds of people who are quieter, who don't speak English as a first language, their viewpoints get lost. So there's a lot of reasons in a software development team, which is working across time zones, to think about how can we do less meetings and still be effective in doing the work that we are trying to do.
Mhm.
And so that was the problem I started to solve, right? And the big challenge, if I can go on for 30 seconds more, is that
Please.
a lot of software development teams follow the principles of Agile, and there are a couple of misunderstood principles out there. So for example, there is a principle that says face-to-face communication is the most effective and efficient way of communicating in a team. Now, if you asked Martin Fowler, who's one of the authors of the manifesto and a colleague, he'll say that's too absolute a principle because that says something about a team that sits together on a day-to-day basis, but it doesn't say anything for a remote team. And he said this way back in 2005. But people have conveniently ignored that statement and interpreted it as, oh, in remote, that means you just need to have lots of meetings. Don't write anything, right? And so I took it on myself to try and correct that understanding and see if I can present alternatives for many of these agile practices for software development teams so they can be more asynchronous in the way they work.
So interesting, because I always looked at that principle and I thought, yeah, it is, maybe you're right. If we're all in the same room together at the same time, we can do great things together. It's true. Like, it's awesome. No question. But like, what if we can't? Like that, and the reality is that most teams we're never going to be in the same room together. Somebody always has a sick kid at home, so then the reality becomes like great principle. The reality is most teams are never going to be in the same room together at the same time. So then what about e-face to e-face? That seems like the next obvious choice, right? So do you get kickback from the Agile community over these async principles, or have people recognize that this is the way, like that because your pain is not, it's not a niche pain.
Yeah, in fact, I've been surprised at how much support there's been for this idea because you see, people realize that they're in a lot of meetings because of this misunderstanding. And the fact remains that nobody joined their companies to sit in meetings. If you look at technologists, most technologists got their jobs because they love writing code, they love creating designs. In my case, they love building prototypes, they like writing copy, that kind of stuff, right? And the more meetings you're in, the more it detracts from these kinds of work that bring you joy. So a lot of technologists understand this. And the other thing is, even if you were to imagine this perfect team that's sitting together, right? In a two-person team, yeah, of course, discuss everything face to face because there's just one line of communication, right? But the moment it goes to three people, that one line of communication becomes three lines. With four people, it becomes 6 lines. With, let's say you have a team of 14 people, you have 91 lines of communication. So people realize that it's really difficult to communicate face to face all the time, right? It gets tiresome after a certain point of time. And then you don't have any reference for, oh, why did I take that decision? Your software evolves over 16 months. And then there's a new tech lead who joins and he says, why is the architecture this way? I have no idea. It looks so silly, right? And you've got no decision record. And then somebody has to go back and find out and do all of this explaining to the new boss. It's just not fun, right? So people have been through that state of pain. And so I understand why people have been more welcoming of it. The challenge isn't that people don't understand it. The challenge is that there is an inertia of doing things a certain way, right? So adopting a new habit means everyone in your team needs to also adopt it. You can't just be the only person doing it. So getting an entire team to work this way is often the challenge, because then, it's only then that you get the network effect of a benefit, right?
Right, indeed. Everybody has to sort of be proactively committed to understanding that this challenge is indeed what they're, a real frustration for the team, and that they're going to want to take steps to solve that. Most teams are really overrun with too many meetings. And indeed, with the time zones, it's painful. Nobody wants to be up at 7 a.m. and doing a meeting first thing in the morning. I mean, come on. Like, I know people are doing it, but wouldn't you really rather be having a cup of coffee and reading the news somewhere quiet, or, doing whatever you like to do, yoga in the morning, whatever you like to do in the morning, right? So, okay, so interesting. So if the whole team has to adopt, and that's a challenge, we still have to start somewhere. So where do you advise teams, like when teams are coming to you and they're like, I'm buried in meetings, where do you start?
Yeah. So one approach that I've been trying out, and it's in the book as well, is this tool set that I've been developing called the Starter Kit. It's called the Async First Starter Kit. And where we start the teams off is to think about where they would like to take their team, right? From a point of view of value. So do you want to make your team more diverse? Do you want to have better knowledge sharing? Would you like to onboard people better? So on and so forth, right? And once you have that notion of value of what are you trying to achieve by shifting your ways of working to be more async, there's a sense of intrinsic motivation that everyone shares, right? And from that point on, we do a few exercises with the team. So they go through a baselining exercise to see, all right, what practices are we following? What practices are we not following? So for example, decision documentation. When we do a meeting, do we write meeting minutes and then circulate them? Do we have an onboarding checklist, for example, for somebody who joins so that they can self-serve themselves onto the team? How long does it take for somebody to get onboarded and write their first piece of code? So they go through that baselining exercise, which tells them, all right, here's what elite might look like, and here's where you are. And from that point on, they can start figuring out those little tweaks that they make to try and get themselves to elite status. There's, of course, some fundamentals that we try to address along the way, right? Like the team has a predictable rhythm. Can you block out half your day for deep work? Can you block out Fridays for deep work? And can you do your meetings in the second half between Monday to Thursday? That's still 16 hours set aside for meetings. That's plenty of meetings, right? Yeah. But what it does by making your deep work hours contiguous is you're giving yourself 24 inviolate hours in the week, which you can use to focus on the things that matter to you.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds ideal. You really have to be, I guess the idea is you have to be very intentional about how to do that. And it lends itself to certain kind of work more than others, I can imagine. Where do you see, where do you see most teams going wrong as the, when you look at how they're working? Well, what are some of the easy, low-hanging fruit things that you see that people can solve?
Yeah, so there are a few easy places to start, right? One of the things, and Cal Newport, the author of Deep Work, talks about this quite a bit, right? We believe a lot in spontaneity, that teams will get together and they'll figure things out. And I think that's correct to a certain extent.
Mm.
For example, if I have to develop a feature for a piece of software, I don't want my manager to be sitting on my shoulder and saying, do it this way. I'd like autonomy to develop the feature using my skills. And sure, I'll make some mistakes along the way, but the cost of those mistakes is really low in software, right?
Mm-hmm.
So work execution needs to be as autonomous as possible. But what Cal Newport says is focus on workflow. So define the process. When does a work move from one stage to another, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you define that? Because then you give everyone a state of calm. Is it in my lane? If it's not in my lane, I'm not going to lose sleep over it yet.
Right.
Once it comes into my lane, then I can think about it, right? Similarly, how do you do decision making? Is there a defined process for it? Because if you get in a 10-member team, all 10 people for every decision into a meeting, before long, you're going to have a lot of churn.
Mm-hmm.
Can you agree which meetings are simple enough that you can write a document, circulate it? If there are no objections, you just move on with it. And then there are some irreversible, tank the business kind of decisions, which, sure, you want more eyeballs on, and you can go a little slower on. And maybe you need a meeting for that as well, right? So I noticed that a lot of teams don't take the time to define their ways of working and their processes. And if they were to do that, take some time, slow down just to do that, that shared understanding can create a lot of calm.
Oh, I
And that's
like
what
how
we're
you put that. Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about how people are visualizing their work together, because for some people, it's Jira or Confluence, for a lot of software teams. For others, it's Miro boards or
yeah.
But in all of those, and some work better than others, depending on, maybe sometimes you're stuck with a tool, but all of them have value in terms of everybody being able to see the work in the same way. So I think that that's one of the key things, but it does seem like that Agile software teams have been doing that well. Like we've been visualizing work from the beginning, right? That's part of like the whole dynamic of it. Uh, so you've also now got this async first manifesto. How did
Yeah.
that come about?
So I've been thinking about that. In fact, I've gone back and forth on whether we should do that, whether we shouldn't do that. And I feel that it's a complement to the original Agile manifesto, because we are living in a time which is, 22 years removed from when they first wrote the manifesto. And many of the principles are still valid. But
Yeah.
what we're missing is a reimagination of work with this very distributed by default kind of work life that we live. So even in my kind of situation, when we staff a team for a client, there's probably a few people working out of Mumbai, some people working out of Pune, some out of Delhi, a whole bunch of places, right? So you can say the entire team is in India, but try as we might, we can't get everyone into the same location because that's how distributed talent is. And at the heart of it, IT, tech is a game of talent. It isn't so much about the software you build, it's about the people. So I wanted to try and get some principles, some values out there, which we universally agree on when it comes to collaborating in a distributed environment. Now, do I have all the words right? I don't think so. I'm rethinking all of those words every day that I look at it, and I hate some of those words even today. I mean, I got some feedback. So what I did was I threw out a first draft, which is admittedly bad, and I'll accept it. What I'd love for people to do is join. There's a Google Doc. Maybe you can share that link with your listeners, and people can comment. And I'm more than happy for them to become collaborators and help me shape that draft so we can share it with other people. and, build a shared understanding of what human diverse teams can look like, what new worlds and new metaphors of collaboration can look like.
I really like your distributed by default. Like this is the reality. We're sort of distributed by default. Even if you have a hybrid team, you really
Yeah.
need to be working in a remote first way because hybrid is remote first. People just don't realize it yet. It will fail unless it's remote first. So we really need to get async right. So I love the angle of distributed by default. Like, okay, so the Agile manifesto was everybody in the same room by default. Like that's how we were sort of thinking. But then most of the principles still apply. But what if we then took the same thing and flipped it on its head and said, now what if we're distributed by default? Like how would that look like? And I love that you're co-creating it with the community asynchronously. That seems very appropriate. Like
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful. I'm very curious how that'll work. Like how, what happens if you get too many cooks in the kitchen? I think it'll probably be beautiful. So
Yeah.
one of the things that really comes up, oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you want to respond.
I just wanted to say that, look, I don't have any of the constraints that the authors of the manifesto had. So they were all at a ski resort and they probably needed to leave soon. And I'm just sitting here at home, right? And I
Right.
can be here for the rest of the year. So if it takes the rest of the year to get that manifesto in shape, I'm in no rush. So my constraints are very different from the constraints that those 17 gentlemen faced back in that ski resort in Colorado.
Right. Right. Indeed. Indeed. And so it's just a different process, which async is a different process. You're sort of combining all of the best things, I think, of being able to take the time and all the feedback and and it's ongoing. Maybe it evolves. Maybe it
Indeed.
doesn't become just one thing. Like who knows? Um, I'd love to ask you about team building and feeling that sense of belonging to a company. That seems to be one of the big things that companies are using as an excuse to draw people back to the office, right? As they're
Yeah.
saying like, oh, there's this lack of feeling of culture. How do we address that? In your async first content and in your playbook, how do you address that?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned at some point that there's a lot of intentionality that needs to be in place. And I think that's a key attribute of any distributed remote leader, right? That you start looking at all of these as problems to solve and you look at them with a very intentional lens. So there are a couple of things that I think we need to get straight. I don't need to have a best friend at work. The company might want it, but it's perfectly okay if the employee doesn't want to have a best friend at work, right? But what I do want is trust and cohesion, right? I should be able to trust the fact that, well, my teammates are skillful, they will be transparent, and that they've got my back just in case something goes wrong, right? And for that, there are a couple of things that are fundamental. So, for example, do you form your team right? Do you have the right kind of people? Because sometimes we don't. Is there a job description in place? Are roles defined clearly? That's important. Second, is information transparent? Because if people are hoarding information, that's automatically a no-go when it comes to trust, right? So do you have the right systems in place? For example, if you're using a task board, does the task board at any given point of time represent what anyone's working on? Because if you don't have that, somebody somewhere is going to think, oh, that person's slacking off. And there goes trust, right? Then there are other aspects where if you're saying, well, we want to build relationships, do you have this culture of meeting people one-on-one? Because that's the most intimate way of building relationships. So are peers meeting people one-on-one? Are managers taking the time to meet people one-on-one? We, for example, in our team have a culture of appreciation. So we have an IM channel, which is called Rockstars. And then at any point of time, you find anything that any colleague did, which you'd like to appreciate. You just appreciate them out loud, right? And so you have that positive contagion that just keeps going on in that particular channel, right? Little things like you can't meet, all right, no problem. Next week, we're doing an Airbnb experience together. So we're going to play a mystery room together. So it's a shared experience, right? So there are things that you can do if you're just intentional about building relationship. And the other thing is there's a lot of cost savings with remote. Now, the problem is that a lot of us, we moan about this thing of no trust, no cohesion, and we rake in the savings. That's obviously going to the bottom line. Can we take some of those savings and put it back into building relationships? Can we start funding maybe travel once a quarter so teams can get together? They can have dinners together, lunches together. You don't have to work. I mean, the thing that gets my goat is this productivity theater where you get together once a quarter and then you pretend as if you're busy. You've been working all quarter. Spend this time having fun together. Maybe go for a lunch. Maybe do an activity together, right? Get away and spend time with each other. Get to know each other, right? So when we do retreats in my team, it's not work. We just get away from the work location, whichever city we get to, and maybe we go camping together. That's what works for us.
Right. So you just decide like, okay, as a team, this is what we're going to do together, or this is what we want as a team building. Because for some people, indeed, you don't need a best friend at work, and some people really don't need their social. They don't get their social input from work, right?
Yeah.
Or from their colleagues, right? I've got a rich social life that doesn't involve all of my colleagues. So I can imagine, yeah. So there's all kinds. And I like the idea that instead of spending money on offices, that instead we're spending money on relationships. It's
Yeah.
just a different way of placing, like, before you spent the money to build relationships on the office. Now you can spend the money to build relationships any way you want. Seems like it opens up a whole new thing of freedom. So we're slowly running out of time here. I've got a million questions, of course, but I want to just ask, like, what is the main resistance to this? Are people, or maybe are people just like beating down the door, like we need more async, or what is the biggest resistance?
I don't think there's as much resistance from the individual. There's the inertia of getting your entire team along, as I mentioned right at the start.
Yeah,
Because look, a lot of software teams operate under a lot of pressure. So
yeah,
they've got deadlines in front of them. They're probably behind the 8 ball already. And now you have to understand changing ways of working does mean that for a period of time, your productivity will dip
yeah,
because now you're going through a paradigm shift. You're saying, well, everything that you did in meetings, now do in writing. If you were not used to writing, you're going to have some friction right there, right? So your productivity will drop. Now, who bells the cat? Because do you have the support from your leaders and management to take that risk and say, well, yeah, we feel like this is going to be better in the long term, but it's going to hurt in the short term. Nobody wants to lose their jobs over that, right? So
yeah,
that's the big chasm that we need to cross, where senior leaders who unfortunately at this point have lost touch with the craft need to start empathizing with teams on the ground and say, well, these teams need some slack. They will improve their ways of working, but in the interim, it's going to hurt. And so how do we support them during that time frame? So what I'm saying is that the friction isn't from practitioners. The friction is in the system, where the system needs to give people space.
right. And in order to do that, we have to slow things down and know leader, like, who wants to be the one that says like, whoa, slow things down. Like we need to retrain the systems. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's indeed tough to put this neck out. So I guess in our last minute, two more last questions, which is, what do you recommend for leaders who are interested in doing this? Like, what are some of the first steps that they should take? They should clearly get the Async First playbook, which I will link to in the show notes. That's clearly what they should do. But like, what would be a first step that you think a leader should take?
Yeah. I mean, even if you don't look at the book, I would say keep an open mind and start looking at organizations that are already doing this well. And this is something I encounter quite a bit, where, you go to a services company and you give them the example of a product company, and they'll say, oh, that's a product company. We're a services company. And then you show a services company, a product company, a services company's example, they'll say, oh, their business is different. The thing is, there's examples of organizations that are doing this well in every sector, right? So look for those bright spots. I'm sure you'll learn something from them. Go speak to leaders in those bright spots and ask them what's working for them. There's a lot we can learn from just stealing ideas. We don't have to come up with ideas from scratch, right?
Yeah, indeed. Lots of people are doing it well.
And your podcast is one of those examples, right? If you just listen to Lisette's podcast every week, you'll probably get
Bonus
some
points.
ideas.
Bonus points for you. Oh man, I had another question, but then I got all distracted by your kudos. Darn, I'm gonna lose it. Yeah, it was something on leaders. Well, I hope it comes back. Darn, that just that just happens. All right, thank you for the kudos. No, it's interesting for in terms of leadership for going async. Like we know we need to do it, but it is difficult to slow down and sometimes take the time to do it. All right, so for the very last question, I would like to ask, where can people find you online? Like if they want to learn more about this, of course, I'll link to the playbook and to the manifesto. But where, if people want to connect with you, where do they go?
Well, I'm off all social media but LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn. It's my first name and last name, Sumit Moge. So you should be able to find me there. And then if you want to follow my work, I blog almost every week. That's on asyncagile.org. And I do a little bit of photography if you are interested. So
Oh,
you can check me out at sumitmoge.com. That's my first name, last name.com. Yeah, those are the three places to find me.
what kind of photography?
Mostly wildlife.
Do you have a particular kind of wildlife, like birds or?
Yeah, big mammals usually, because I don't know if you can see right behind me. I've got a cabinet full of camera equipment right there.
Wow, awesome. Oh, I see a
So
lens, indeed.
yeah, right there.
Or, cool,
Oops, sorry. Yeah, there.
cool, cool. Love it. Okay, well, we'll check it out. I'll definitely link to that in the show notes. Sumit, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I took copious notes and I hope to share those in the show notes with people. So thank you again so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Until next time, everybody, be powerful.